Welcome, everyone, to The Surfing Historian. I'm your host, Jason Old, historian, surfer, and world traveler. This podcast is dedicated to highlighting some of the latest scholarly research in the social sciences and in the field of surf studies. So paddle out with us while we glide through the world of academia. Joining me from Florida is my friend and colleague, Professor Michael Losasso. Michael's a historian of Cold War cultural history whose research focuses on the Cold War, film, and media technology. For this episode, we're going to focus on two films in particular from the 1960s that I believe are significant in their own right, The Endless Summer and Dr. Strangelove. I know these are two radically different films in theme and format, but my question for you, Michael, is this. How did these two culturally significant movies make use of wartime advances in media production developed during World War II and later in the Cold War to pull off making these monumental films? I'm stoked to hear your thoughts on that, as well as to learn a bit more about your dissertation research. But before you dive deeper into these movies, I want to take a second to personally thank you and our listeners for being part of this episode of The Surfing Historian.
Thank you, Jason. It's a pleasure to be here. So yes, my dissertation is on the Cold War's effects on the portrayal of World War II on American television, especially the documentary series, and kind of charting how the war was shown on TV throughout the Cold War, from its inception in the late 40s up to about the end in the 80s. Cold War ended in 91 officially, but that's as far as I could get. But yeah, anyways, on Endless Summer, that is a great movie because it really does encapsulate a lot of the themes that would come to be the undercurrent of the counterculture of the 1960s. Specifically, freedom, mobility, kind of breaking out against the social norms of the period where, conformity, the nuclear family, living in suburbia and all of that became the ideal of American culture. But this was saying, no, this is another alternative. This is something you don't have to subscribe to the normality of the situation. You can move about, you can enjoy life and be one with the waves. It was an answer, an alternative that came to kind of be the hallmark of the counterculture in a sense.
Yeah, and you know what? You bring up a really great point. And what's interesting, and again, I know this is something that you spend a whole lot of time researching, and that is really the technology for the media and media production was accelerated. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, of course, but I believe it was accelerated by World War II wartime technology, and I'd imagine went into overdrive during the Cold War. And, the reason I bring that up is because of the director of Endless Summer, Bruce Brown, was actually in the Navy. And so I guess it's worth clarifying really quickly for the listeners that, the Endless Summer movie I'm talking about is the original one, which was an independent film in 1964 and then hit the big screen in 1966. And, a number of the listeners who might be from my generation certainly remember the 1994 movie, which, they did go to a lot of the same spots, really to sort of see how things had changed. But, of course, they also go to some other spots. But anyways, back to my point, a lot of the technology that came about that was used for the filming of really what, we could define as a surf travel movie was technology developed by the Department of Defense. And so I guess my question is, can you elaborate a little bit on how that technology came about and perhaps why it was the Department of Defense that was the one working on this type of media technology in the first place?
Sure. I mean, there's the practical reason in that, yes, this technology was part of a larger push at technological superiority of the United States over the Soviet Union. And it was necessary to have lighter cameras, faster films that could shoot in more varied terrains, so that way they could make accounts of various movements, mock maneuvers, and to highlight their technology. I mean, that opening scene in Doctor Strangelove with the plane refueling, that's all military shot footage from the Department of Defense. And Kubrick, he was at first concerned, like, well, shouldn't we shoot this ourselves? I don't know if the right angles are going to be there. And the guy who supplied him the footage said, don't worry about it. The military loves to show off their latest technologies. You can guarantee they've shot this from every possible angle just to show it off. So the technology development was in part practical. It could be used by their troops on fact-finding, scouting, and other operations, but also it was to, publicize themselves.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you helping make sense of that and, even historically contextualizing the rise of, what we might even consider enhanced film quality and these more modern techniques. And so I guess it shouldn't be surprising that an individual who was in the service at the time and who, perhaps had access to this new technology would be someone who would go on to eventually make this film. And I guess it's worth mentioning that Bruce Brown himself was a surfer and, from what I understand, wanted to be stationed in Hawaii when he joined the Navy, specifically to be able to surf. And so you might even, say that him stumbling across this new film technology by way of the military, seemed almost serendipitous. So, I know that you mentioned Dr. Strangelove as well. And since I've been sitting here talking a lot about the Endless Summer, would you mind talking a little bit more about Dr. Strangelove? Because I believe that film also comes out around the same time as the Endless Summer. Am I right?
Yeah. Just like how Endless Summer was made in 1964, Dr. Strangelove was released in 1964. And that film was really a warning about the stockpiling of nuclear weapons and the Cold War mentality at the time of mutually assured destruction, MAD. And it's really playing the whole notion that bombing the USSR, the Soviet Union, will lead to an enormous nuclear backlash that will destroy the world, basically, make it uninhabitable, which, by the way, was actually a real proposal put to Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, was we'd line a ship off the coast with 1,000 megaton nuclear warhead, the largest we can make. So that way, if we're ever attacked, we detonate that and pollute the air. So that way, almost no human life can survive within such and such a radius. Khrushchev had the good knowledge to say, no, that's too much. But going off that possibility that could happen, and that's the extent that technology is at nowadays, where we are talking about worldwide annihilation, it's like, I can't even think about it. And then just finding just the humor in that. It's like, oh, good gosh, all it takes is one crazy guy to trigger all this from happening and to stop the flow of communication. And no one questions him because it's this whole line of authority that we've created to the American public. Trust in the military, makes boys into men, defends our nation. Why would we lie to you? Kind of makes you think, well, maybe we should take a step back and re-examine things.
It's quite impressive how you're able to weave both of those together. And, as you were talking, there was something that, I found really intriguing and, even fascinating. And, as far as the two movies are concerned, these are two radically different movies that come out in the same year in 1964. But, they come out in the wake of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. And, as you know, that was a significant event in the Cold War and in terms of, the Soviet Union and the United States and geopolitics in general. And so the thought of these two directors shooting these films with that as the backdrop is, I find that extremely fascinating. And so, but, there was a few things I want to pick your brain about, and I'm actually going to bring you back to the Endless Summer movie because I want to look at its significance historically. And so, looking at the time period, there's a number of things going on. For example, it's a more accessible airline travel, for example, for the general public. And again, this is, I know this is your time period, so please, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. And, but, as far as the general public is concerned as well, coming out of the 50s, it's my understanding that there was a bit more disposable income as well. And so, taking that as a whole, combining that with, like I said, modernized airline travel for now leisure travelers, because this becomes increasingly more popular. And, all of a sudden the Endless Summer movie comes out, and it, for me, I would argue that it engendered a new generation of surfer. And, what I mean by that is, surfers are now no longer just looking to surf their home break or their local break in places like Southern California or Gold Coast, Australia, or Hawaii, just to give some examples. Now they're looking abroad. Now they're looking at, these obscure and lesser known surf spots that were exposed by the movie. And so I guess what I find interesting about all of that is, you have this movie come out, we have this modernized air travel and, people with a bit more disposable income. And, that really, people that were now interested in engaging in, what we would call travel or tourism. So in a sense, it created this perfect storm that, in terms of surfing, right? Because I know there's other travelers other than surfing. And so I'm specifically talking about surfing. It really engendered a new generation of surf traveler and took surfing and surf travel to a whole new dimension. And so I want to bring you back to the actual question I had for you, since I kind of went off on a bit of a tangent there. But, I know we've talked about, media technology and the advancements, and you really attribute that to the Department of Defense and, as wartime technology. But I guess my question is could the same be said about airline travel? Can we attribute it to advancements in technology on the part of the Department of Defense, or is that not a fair thing to say?
I don't know if I'd make that direct of a comparison. I mean, yes, jet technology that was fostered in large part by the Department of Defense and contracting work out to things like Hughes Aircraft did lead to that rapid development in jet technology, which was taken up by the airlines, who did lead to faster travel, meaning more flights, meaning cheaper airfare. So more people could take part of that. But yeah, it was also the rise of this new opportunity, this new ability to now you can be anywhere in just a few hours. The whole jet set lifestyle as embodied in the Frank Sinatra song, "Come Fly With Me." And absolutely, I think movies like Endless Summer that did kind of show the variety of locations and just the exoticism of it. Not only is it in this really tropical, or I should say unique spots where they're surfing, but also just what they're doing. The whole sport of surfing was something that was still fairly foreign to a lot of Americans. And I found it interesting what you said earlier, that the director had been in the military, because, I mean, surfing owes a large part of its appeal in the United States, or should they spreading of its appeal, thanks to World War II, when a lot of GIs were stationed in the Pacific, on Hawaii, on the Hawaiian Islands, and then later in the wider South Pacific, because that is where surfing, was born to an extent. And that's where many of them picked it up and made, their own types of boards and all that. And they brought that, they wanted to take it back with them to the States. So they helped to begin popularizing it. And the director was probably caught up within that, because the appeal of it stayed even after the war in the military. You still had surfing amongst the Navy and the GIs on the bases in the Pacific, and so on and so forth.
You know what it did was, and again, thank you for helping me, and I'd imagine a number of our listeners understand the background of the modernization of the airline industry. And, so what ends up happening, and again, I don't want to steal your thunder because I'm curious to see how you tie all this into your research. Maybe not a movie like The Endless Summer, but certainly Dr. Strangelove, which is, a Cold War film. And so, but what airline travel did, and certainly what the Endless Summer movie did in the 60s, is it put in the psyche of, what I was saying earlier, a new generation of surf traveler. And, now this film shows, these surfers that they can go to, as you were saying earlier, these exotic places and, effectively surf uncrowded world-class waves. And so, what I find fascinating and intriguing is how everything, how you can contextualize it all historically. And, of course, it goes without saying the wide-ranging impacts of the Endless Summer movie itself, on the surfing world. And so, I'd say from that point forward, surf travel in many respects, at least, I would argue, for anyone that considers himself or herself a serious surfer, it becomes what you might consider to be a rite of passage to a certain extent, especially in this day and age. And so, I want to move away from this film because, as you can see, I could talk about this film all afternoon. And, because honestly, I'd like to know how you personally tie in media and media production into your dissertation and research.
Well, my dissertation is largely tracking, what were the factors that led to the production of this television series or this television special. What was the political situation at the time? How did that political situation filter out into the public mindset that led the network to saying this was going to be popular or this would have some appeal? Like when writing about this obscure documentary series from the 70s called The Unknown War about the Nazi-Soviet war, the Eastern Front of World War II, and seeing that this whole series was made possible because of eased relations between the United States and the Soviet Union in the 1970s under détente that allowed for more cultural exchanges. Also saw the first Hollywood film shot on location in Russia, and that allowed this collaboration, this co-production between the Soviet Union and the United States to happen. It was considered popular because, one, there was this new interest in the Soviet Union because there was more dialogue and exchange, but two, also because you saw rebirth in appeal of World War II media, thanks to World at War, the documentary series that came out in 1975, and also just the notion that here's a side of the war public knows almost nothing about because the Eastern Front was effectively whitewashed from the popular World War II narrative after World War II when the Soviets became our enemies.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And again, just tying in how Department of Defense technology played a role in making these films and, even to a certain extent, I'd imagine, disseminating them as well. And, just the whole notion that the military helped facilitate advances in media production is something, I'd imagine is new information for a number of our listers.
Yeah, the Department of Defense dominated these films for the first 15 years from 47 when the Department of Defense was created and given a television, film, radio branch up until the mid-60s where they couldn't really provide Hollywood studios or television studios with the equipment from the World War II or Korea era or with advisors who could instruct them onto the conduct of soldiers or the camps or the battle sites from that conflict. And they no longer needed the approval, so they no longer needed to go to the Department of Defense and make sure that it was all got their approval so they could make more types of war films, more themes.
When would you say that the fallout, and I'm using that, sort of quote unquote fallout between the Department of Defense or government, and I'm using the use of the word government loosely, and in Hollywood, when did that fallout take place? And I guess where I'm going with this question is, when was that fallout to where, forgive me for generalizing, where Hollywood became antagonistic, if you will, to the political ideology or even foreign policy ambitions of the government? Where did all that start?
It really did begin in the 60s. There's a great chapter on this in the book Guts and Glory by Edward Said, where it was really the production of the film The Longest Days, a World War II film about the Normandy invasion, where there was this huge uproar over the level of resources the Department of Defense was pouring into that film, based on the belief that would help their image and help spur recruitment, which led to a congressional investigation, but also just the limited amount of aid they could give to production, in the sense that we couldn't really supply you with period tanks or rifles or aircraft or trucks from that time anymore because we've already modernized. So that led to the limiting of the amount of support the Department of Defense could give Hollywood. And two, led Hollywood to say, well, if we can't get this from the Department of Defense anymore, where are we going to get it from? Which led to new relations with museums, with private collections, with historical societies. And that just kind of grew and grew and grew. And then as you got this rising critique of the US military and the US government, with the Vietnam War really reaching a fever pitch by 1970, you kind of had Hollywood saying that, well, it really doesn't pay to toe the line and go by the official history or the official narrative that the government is spewing or that the Pentagon is backing. We need to have a wider view of things, which is why in 1970 you had 3 films that did not get Department of Defense approval: MASH, Catch-22, and Patton.
It seems like it really comes down to the fact that, and perhaps I'm oversimplifying a very nuanced and multifaceted issue, but it seems like it comes down to Hollywood no longer relying on the funding of the Department of Defense. In other words, they weren't funding these film projects, so they no longer had, let's say, the final word or final approval. And, with Hollywood going out and pursuing other forms of funding and, as you said, other information like archives and resources, like that, they were no longer bound to the political ideology, or I guess you might even say the foreign policy or narrative espoused or disseminated by the Pentagon, the State Department, or, the Department of Defense, who they'd historically relied on for funding. Is that a fair thing to say?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Especially for the historical movie. The World War II movies or Korean War movies, where the Pentagon really couldn't supply them with much of anything. So it was just kind of a token gesture. I mean, a little different when you're doing something like a Vietnam-centered movie or a modern day war movie, I guess. Because when Francis Ford Coppola, he really wanted to get Pentagon backing because he was doing Apocalypse Now as kind of through his own studio with his own money, and having their resources would have been big help because that's still all period equipment for the war we're talking about. But they would not approve of the narrative of the military sending an assassin to take out one of their own generals. So he never got approval because he wouldn't agree to change the storyline.
I feel like I keep trying to bring it back to surfing, not intentionally, but you mentioned Apocalypse Now, and there's the famous quote, "Charlie, don't surf." And Scott Laderman actually writes a great book called Empire in Waves, and he actually talks about this time period. According to what he was writing, there were the United States servicemen that were there were actually surfing over in Vietnam. And I believe they would even hold surf contests, if I'm not mistaken. And so, I'll let our fact checkers double check me on that one. But so the whole idea of Charlie don't surf comes from Charlie being the VC, Victor Charlie, which is what the U.S. code name was for the Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese. And so it was this suggestion that, Charlie or Victor Charlie or the North Vietnamese, they don't surf. So we're going to take this beach and we're going to use it for us to surf. And again, I'm, sort of generalizing that, but that's where the expression came from, because it was suggesting that, well, the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong don't surf. So, we're going to take this beach and surf kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's this deeper undercurrent of the surf culture with the movie. I mean, surfing and Apocalypse Now are in one sense entwined because, one, the author of Apocalypse Now, John Milius, he was an avid surfer. He later made a movie about surfing. But two, and I think more presently for our case, was that Coppola, the director, he has said in several interviews that he always saw Vietnam as a West Coast war. It was a war, unlike World War II, where you had the Brooklyn guy and the guy from the small farm town in Iowa and all that. With Vietnam, it was all that surfing culture. It was the weed. It was the, statements on the helmets and the gear. It was the, counterculture politics entwined with the military culture. And all that can kind of be found in the surfing culture as well. So by having surfing in the film, it was kind of him punctuating that idea that this is a different kind of war. This is the West Coast war of the United States.
Interesting. Yeah. And I really enjoy your perspective on this because, on the one hand, I can offer, the surfer mentality and, but you bring in that film, you've studied the interviews, these films inside and out. And, so it's an interesting way to sort of help understand these events from two really different perspectives. And I think it helps to also historically contextualize, like, we started the top of the show with these two really different movies, The Endless Summer and the, Dr. Strangelove, which were released in the same year. Like I said, at least Endless Summer as an independent film. I'm not sure if Dr. Strangelove was an independent film then, but, both radically different movies using Department of Defense technology. And so it's really interesting to be able to historically contextualize those and see how they came about and how the Department of Defense and their technological advances actually facilitated the launch of and filming of these movies.
Oh, absolutely. And also it kind of speaks to the emerging kind of counterculture that was percolating in the United States at that time in the mid-'60s that would later really expand and come to fore by the late 60s. And that was Dr. Strangelove, kind of the questioning of what had been established Cold War strategy, political tactics, but also just moving away from that of domestic containment, the nuclear family, the house in the suburbs. You'll enjoy your Sundays by going to church and playing bridge with your neighborhood. No, you don't have to do that anymore. You can move out of suburbia. You can go to the beach now and surf, which is a really wholly individual activity in a sense, because it's you, your board, and the waves. And in that sense, you're moving away from what was seen as standard practice, regular culture, and indulging in this new venture, the one that has, like you said, a kind of increased appeal because of the jet setter lifestyle, the eased access to travel. So now you can go about and move from place to place for the waves, for the experience, which had that very countercultural undercurrent and criticism of established Cold War policy was another aspect of that counterculture.
When you step away and look at the big picture, pun intended, you can see how a lot of these moving parts come together in films like this. Things that seem mutually exclusive coalesce in a sense in these films. It's whether it's the technology and the counterculture and all of these things sort of coming together, and you see that, like I said, both in the Endless Summer movie as well as Dr. Strangelove. Like you see the cultural critique and the pausing and saying, hold on, wait a minute, we could effectively destroy humanity. And then, on the other hand, with the Endless Summer movie, this new idea of hopping on an airplane with a surfboard and traveling around the world to surf, like that is actually a possibility. And,
Yes.
I think both movies are worthy of recognition. And with that, I actually want to give you the last word.
Thank you so much for having me on, Jason. It's been a real pleasure. I don't get a chance to really talk about this stuff, my research, my love of film and Cold War history enough. So thank you for this great opportunity. Thank you for all the people at University of South Florida who support me with this research, my advisor, Dr. David K. Johnson, people on my committee, Golfo Alexopoulos, Julia Irwin, Christopher Sherritt, and all the others who support me, my family and my girlfriend, fellow academic, Mindy McConey. Thanks a lot.
If you found this discussion with Professor Losasso about media production trends in the Cold War, as well as the technological advancements spurred on by the U.S. Navy to be thought-provoking and intriguing, I'd like to invite you to check out my next episode, where I'll be talking with my friend Professor Charlie Harris about his research on the role the U.S. Navy played in facilitating the rise of American empire at the end of the 19th century. In this discussion, we'll also talk about consumer culture, Commodore George Dewey, and even the role board games played in shaping Americans' perception of the Spanish-American and Philippine-American wars. You won't want to miss this upcoming episode. This has been another episode of The Surfing Historian. I'm your host, Jason Old. Be sure to share, like, and subscribe to never miss an episode. Again, thanks for listening, and until next time, stay stoked.